Hello, welcome to another episode of Talk Lex podcast. I'm Scott Peterson. Giovanna is here with me today. Just a quick reminder, this podcast is brought to you by Durazio Peterson. If you have questions or need help with personal injury or employment-related matters, reach out to us or visit our website at duraziopeterson.com, Instagram at Durazio Peterson, YouTube at Durazio Peterson, and on all the socials. If you have questions about the podcast, check us out at Talk Lex on Instagram or again on the socials. So a couple of things in the news that we wanted to talk about this week. First off is a profile that was in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago, fairly large, what I would call a bit of a takedown of celebrity employment women's rights lawyer, more women's rights than employment, Gloria Allred, who I learned from this article is 83 years old and still actively practicing law, which is pretty impressive. So why don't you kind of give us kind of some context and background, and then we can get into a couple parts of the article, which I read and thought was actually very interesting, especially doing what we do, because we know a lot of the behind the scenes on how these cases are resolved.
Yeah, so it seems like from the article that some of her former clients have kind of come forward as part of, I don't know if this was like an investigation that the Wall Street Journal sort of initiated on its own or how it came about. I was kind of like surprised to see it in general. But ultimately, the sort of premise of the article is that despite her being a very public, sort of very forward-facing person on women's rights issues, she does a lot of press conferences with her clients. Ironically, I think I do not think we can ignore the fact that I think what put her, one of the many things that has put her on the map was that she represented Scott Peterson's mistress when she came out and witness against him. We must acknowledge that. I'm pretty sure, hopefully I'm not getting that totally wrong, but I'm pretty sure that she was her attorney and represented her in kind of coming forward in that situation.
A quick Google search reveals that you are in fact correct. I cannot escape it. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, Scott Peterson will always be a pertinent topic in our lives. So anyway, she does a lot of, represents a lot of clients against very high profile people. So she's in the news a lot. So basically the premise of this article is that some of her clients, in hindsight, did not feel really adequately supported by her. And I think what they're sort of, and are saying that kind of behind the scenes, perhaps she's not as willing to fight as much as her public persona may indicate, because some of these women are saying that they felt pressured into signing settlement agreements with the wrongdoer or their employer that included confidentiality agreements, NDAs, usually sometimes there's like non-disparagement. And they felt that that was contrary to her public persona of, blowing these people up and holding them accountable, and being, very vocal about it. I'll stop talking for a minute. I'm very of two minds about this. I think that this is definitely one of those, we have our segment misleading headline of the week. This is definitely something that if you read it as an employment attorney is not the bombshell that I think it was intended to be.
I think I agree with you. I'm also of two minds when it comes to this, because we've been doing this for a long time, and confidentiality and non-disparagement agreements come up all the time in the context of settlements. And lawyers feel very differently about it depending upon who you ask. I have a colleague who handles primarily medical malpractice cases, whom I respect greatly and is a great lawyer. and will not agree to confidentiality. That's one of his principal core beliefs. He will not agree to it. And he will blow up a settlement if it comes down to it. And his position is in the malpractice setting at least, they usually bend and they will usually agree not to have it in. But his feeling is that it does a disservice to the goal of protecting the rights of patients when you agree to confidentiality and you allow, in his case, doctors or hospitals who have made mistakes basically get away with it without having it made public. Now, I respect his opinion on that. I don't agree with it 100% because at least in the employment context, which is the subject of the Gloria Allred piece, I think we have seen personally that there are many times where it is beneficial, we think, to the client, and the client in fact wants it to be confidential, and particularly non-disparaging, especially when it's mutual, that I don't think it's like a one-size-fits-all approach. And I suspect that Gloria Allred, feels or felt the same way and recognize that there are situations where it makes sense to have confidentiality, and where if it helps resolve the claim for your client, that is really your obligation. Your obligation is not to, some bigger issue, even though you may want it to be. Your obligation is ultimately to your client and doing what's in their best interest. So that's kind of my soapbox approach to it, or thought on it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. I mean, on the medical malpractice thing, I think my feeling a little bit on that is that confidentiality agreements are not as common in that context anyway, or like in personal injury cases, like not quite as common. So I feel like you probably have a little bit more of a leg to stand on to just like cross that out of your agreement and see if anybody makes a fuss about it. I think in employment cases, like you said, they're much more common, given the sort of privacy issues on both sides of an employment conflict. Like they tend to be can be much more personal, and more contentious. Like obviously personal injury cases are contentious too, but they're contentious in a different way. I think there's a lot of personal feelings involved in employment cases that make them sort of unique. But I think a lot with the Gloria Allred situation, my takeaway from it was a lot of communication. I think anybody going into a lawsuit or litigation situation, you have to be very open with each other, the attorney and the client, as to what you're trying to accomplish. I could see where the disconnect could come up with somebody like Gloria Allred, who is very public. And you could feel that, well, if she is not public in my case, or she's telling me not to be public in my case, but she's doing it maybe in somebody else's case, or the reason why I came to her in the first place was because of what, she's doing for X, Y, and Z client that I saw very publicly, there can be a disconnect between what am I trying to accomplish? Like from my perspective in our employment practice, and I try to be, I think I am very clear with people as to what the service is that I feel that I am providing, is to hold people accountable within the context of a lawsuit, which is public. Not that I'm taking it and going to the newspaper with it, but that's a public filing. So to the extent that you do not want to be silenced, a way of not being silenced is to publicly file your lawsuit. And then in employment cases in general, from our perspective, yes, there's an element of holding someone accountable for doing something wrong, but really you are trying to be compensated for the fact that you have lost your job. And that is a financial piece of it. That is probably the largest piece of it in some ways, depending on what the client is trying to accomplish. For most people, that's the biggest piece of it. They're out of work. They don't have a new job. The purpose of their lawsuit is to not go into a financial ruin and to help them get to the next point in their life. If your goal, on the other hand, is to expose an employer or an individual publicly and publicly take them down in some way that does not maybe have a financial component to it, that is kind of something different. And I think that you have to make sure that you're on the same page with your lawyer as to what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because one of the things that I read in the article was that at least one of the complaints, if not more than one, were situations where the client hired her for a specific complaint and the case was settled, or the claim was settled, like within a day or 2 days, probably because of the threat of her going public. So there was a particular situation involving an author, Neil Gaiman, and somebody who had worked for him accused him of inappropriate sexual contact. And apparently the person hired Gloria Allred, and the case was settled the next day. Again, the claim, because there was no lawsuit filed. And so in that situation, there's nothing public, and the person sort of felt, I think, slighted by maybe not having had the ability to come out and talk about it. But I think your point is exactly right, and that's what we talk to clients about, which is once you file a lawsuit, it doesn't matter if ultimately there's confidentiality to some extent, because whatever you write in your lawsuit is always going to be public. I mean, it can always be pulled up, it can always be looked at, and in a lot of times the lawsuit documents, the complaint, are fairly specific and make significant and specific allegations. And just so anyone listening or watching understands how this works, confidentiality basically means that when you resolve a legal dispute, so employer has agreed to pay you $100,000, and in exchange for that, you have to sign a release. And as part of the release, there's a settlement agreement, and as part of the settlement agreement, they may ask for confidentiality, and that basically says you agree that you will not talk about the amount of money that you were paid, the circumstances surrounding the lawsuit, or anything basically disparaging to the company. Now, in a lot of cases, or sometimes, we'll negotiate in mutual language that says, okay, now employer, you're not going to talk about this employee in a negative way either. But that's typically how it plays out. So yeah, you might be agreeing not to talk about it anymore, but the fact remains that the matter was publicly filed if there was a lawsuit, and that can still be exposed. So, I think
in her situation, they're kind of making it like if you write a letter at the very beginning and you settle something very early and the person never got to speak publicly, I mean, that's another, to me, a communication issue, because if you're, writing a letter and you're saying you did this wrong, I want this amount of money, your leverage at that point is the fact that you have not gone public. There's not a huge, your leverage in these types of cases, if you're looking to settle them early, is this hasn't been made public yet. I haven't filed a lawsuit yet. Therefore, you're not spending tens of thousands of dollars paying a lawyer to defend you. You can't necessarily always have it both ways. And I think what can be hard for people to understand is that when you see things going on super publicly, you really don't know what is actually happening behind the scenes. Correct. So she could be very public with one client, but that client might end up getting zero money, or their case could be dismissed, or, that's what I think can be hard about. Obviously you need all types of people in the world. And I think Gloria Allred has done, a lot of good, obviously. I mean, she's been practicing for a really long time. I think she has a lot of benchmark sort of Title VII kind of cases under her belt. And she has exposed a lot of bad, behavior. But I think that's where the disconnect can come about, in terms of what are you doing, for me. And I think a couple of the women that they interviewed, and I empathize with this because I can see how this can happen. A lot of them settled with, bad guys before 10 million other women came out against them. And that can be a bitter pill to swallow, because you can kind of feel like now I'm not allowed to participate in this conversation because I have a confidentiality agreement or a non-disparagement agreement or something like that. But that's really like, kind of a hindsight issue. I mean, ultimately, especially in an employment context, some of these people are sexual assaulters or that's a little bit different. But in an employment context, you're really looking to be compensated financially for your time out of work, depending on how egregious it is. I think one of her clients was alleging that they had been raped by a coworker. Obviously that is horrible. That being said, there are tremendous privacy issues with a case like that being public, even going through the whole legal process that people have to take into consideration. I would not think that a client should necessarily feel betrayed if their attorney is very honest with them about what could happen if you moved forward in certain types of lawsuits. I think one of the women said, I didn't feel supported because a lot of text messages that I wrote that were sort of sexually charged on her end were brought to the attorney's attention. I mean, in my opinion, I see both sides of that. It's your lawyer does have an obligation to tell you what could be harmful to your case and what could blow up to not only impact whether you're successful in your case from a purely legal perspective, but what could be like a life-destroying piece of information that goes out into the universe. Like, you have to tell people that, and then you can decide together, am I going to move forward or not? But, some of the stuff that was in there, I really felt like a lawyer would not be doing their job if they did not tell you that there was a risk in moving forward in certain types of situations.
Yeah, that was going to be my next comment, was that multiple clients sort of complained about, they felt either pressured or bullied not to pursue litigation, or because of things like that you discussed, because negative information was going to come out. In one case, apparently she advised the client that, if you file a lawsuit, you're going to be pulled apart in public, and you're going to be, your whole past is going to come up. And people, in hindsight are frustrated by that. And I understand their frustration, but it's exactly what you said. And we have these conversations with clients all the time, which is, if we're not making you aware of the downside risks of making a public filing and public statements, we're not doing our job, because the only people who benefit in that case from public, exposure are the attorneys. And if we know or anticipate that by making this public filing, you are going to be ripped apart as a plaintiff, we have to make you aware of that and talk about the potential implications of that, because even if you win your lawsuit or the case is settled, that stuff still exists online, and now that's following you around, and pretending it's not is ignoring reality, especially now. So I'm with you. I'm of very two minds of it. I think she's probably giving the best advice she can. I mean, I obviously am not present. Maybe her delivery is not the best, but as someone behind the scenes who sees these conversations, I don't think it doesn't seem like it's necessarily the wrong approach. I did want to ask you about one other part about it, with like media rights. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that more probably, weighs into what, attorneys' kind of ethical obligations are and whatnot. I mean, I thought the most sort of compelling example in her, in this article, was one of her clients who actually did not want her case to be public, and she spoke about it in a documentary. New York has ethical rules about that. Her practice is in California. I thought was, that person's sort of storyline within this article, I thought was the one that made me like the most kind of like, wait a minute, something doesn't seem right about that. But yeah, I think we were talking about, when your attorney is sort of a celebrity in their own right, I do think that you can have some conflicts that can come up about, and on the flip side of it, like in that situation, you know, some of these women are coming out and saying, I would have liked to have spoken out more. I felt like I was pressured into being silenced. On the flip side, there's people who are like, I feel like I was being used as a prop, and I feel like I was being paraded around, and then behind the scenes, I wasn't being supported. So I think, you know, that's tough. And I think a lot of it really is, like, to me, my whole takeaway mostly from the article was you really have to be on the same page. And I feel like over time in our practice, I have probably erred on the side of over communicating to especially employment clients about what our philosophy is on being public and what we are trying to accomplish for them in the lawsuit. You know, and we have had, I think, things come up kind of on both sides of it. And I always go back to, like, people need to be very cautious about what they read about online about lawsuits, because you really just don't know what's going on in the background. Like, we had a case a few years ago against like a very prominent investment bank. And at the beginning of the case, we got contacted by like national sort of news sources to report on this case. And our client was very adamantly against speaking about this. So we did not issue any statements about it whatsoever, and it kind of got lost. At the same time, somebody else was on the front page of the financial section of the New York Times against the same employer with this similar issues. Our case, you know, was resolved in a favorable way. That case was dismissed.
Yeah.
So
well, and
I kept an eye on it, and for various reasons, you know, so you really don't know what's going on. And the fact that that case was on the front page of the New York Times may have done good in and of itself. Like, that was a case where I felt like that should be in the newspaper. Mine should have been in the newspaper too, but my client was like, would have died to be on the front page of the New York Times, you know?
Well, our client was aware of the fact that the exposure would negatively impact their professional career in that case, because in that business, the client was well aware of the fact that everyone talks, everyone reads these publications, and that would be a negative check against the client in the future. And so the client was cognizant of that. And I think ultimately probably the best result came because the case was resolved favorably and the client was allowed to move on in the career. All right, so anything else on that before we move on?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Next up, Starbucks, which this one hits close to home. Our daughter is in middle school, and if it were up to her, she would get Starbucks every day. I dislike Starbucks because I don't like their coffee or anything else that they serve. But Starbucks got hit in California with a $50 million jury verdict for hot tea that spilled on a Postmates delivery driver who was going through the drive-in. So some background, everybody probably remembers the hot coffee case. There was a documentary about it years ago. Someone got hot coffee spilled on them and got a big jury verdict. And everybody was all up in arms about, you know, how bad this is from, you know, because of greedy lawyers, but it turned out that the person had suffered severe burns. Similar case here. This driver went up to the delivery window. Apparently the barista at the drive-in window did not put the lid on his tea properly. And when she handed him a tray with multiple cups in it, and one of them didn't have the lid on, and it spilled onto his lap. And it severely burned his genitals and his legs, and he's had multiple surgeries and skin grafts, and it's pretty bad. I mean, this happened 5 years ago. And so $50 million is a lot of money. I don't know him personally, but I know of the attorney who tried the case very well. His name is Nick Rowley, and he is known for getting massive jury verdicts all over the country on cases. He's probably considered the best trial lawyer in the country. And so it's not surprising to see his name associated with this. He's represented plaintiffs against Monsanto, gotten massive verdicts in those cases and other cases. So he was able to show the jury that, this guy's life has been profoundly made worse, and Starbucks says they're going to appeal. I don't know if they'll get the verdict reduced, but what do you think of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably most men think their wear is worth $50 million at least.
Definitely.
So I just think, it's like the coffee case of McDonald's, who I actually think if people are interested in that case, it kind of became at the time like, oh, plaintiffs' lawyers are horrible and people have frivolous lawsuits and this is completely ridiculous. But it's actually a sad story if you read about it. And the woman only wanted McDonald's it was like an older lady. She only wanted McDonald's to pay her medical bills, and that's it. And they dug their heels in and they wouldn't do like anything to help her. And then so she took it all away and she ends up getting this big verdict. It's not like she, like extorted it from them or anything like that. And it was nowhere near, I think it was like $1.7 million. It was like nothing like this Starbucks verdict. I mean, it's one of those things that like every other lawyer in the country is probably like, yeah, it would be great to have a case like this. Simultaneously, you're like telling your own clients, like, this is an outlier and most people are not getting this much money. California, I think from my perception, gets the biggest verdicts in the country in general.
Right.
And I think this is another example. I mean, we always kind of go back to this, that you're going to see this in the news for a few days, but you're really going to have very little sense of how it actually shakes out. And it's very possible that, if they appeal or if they make a motion to reduce, the verdict or whatever, that it could settle, for some amount of money less than $50 million. And we will never really probably hear about it.
Yeah, but for all the people who criticize these kind of verdicts, anyone who's taken a sip of tea or coffee from one of those places and has burned their mouth recognizes that it's scalding hot, and the failure to put the lid on right is probably negligence. So
yeah, I mean, I think they were definitely, I think even the lawyer for Starbucks, when he was talking about they think the verdict is excessive, was still like, yes, we accept it. Yeah, and as someone who, I mean, I've been a big baby about this, but I had surgery a couple weeks ago, and as even just one surgery has disrupted my life significantly. So I do, think that it's not insignificant to have multiple surgeries on a sensitive part of a man's anatomy, I'm sure.
For all the Seinfeld fans, this obviously reminds me of the time that Kramer got hot coffee spilled on him and was in a negotiation with his lawyer, Jackie, and they offered free coffee for life. And before they could offer the rest of the settlement, he accepted it in one of the classic Seinfeld scenes.
Yeah, so my father had a hot food case, like there where somebody got takeout and was holding like the styrofoam container and it spilled in their lap, also a man, and was like molten hot. And like he, if that case had settled for $50 million, perhaps I would be sitting at my parents' beach compound right now doing this.
You should have called Nick Rowley.
Not the most uncommon situation, apparently.
Yeah. So yeah, that's an interesting one. Featuring a major player who, Starbucks. People like Starbucks. They're probably not the most sympathetic defendant in the world, considering how much money they make. So, all right. Next and last topic, I think you wanted to talk about your new favorite TV show, Love Is Blind. Is that right?
No. All right. I like how you said you wanted to talk about. So the topic of this is people disagreeing about politics and breaking up. So we immediately are going into this with a disagreement as to whether this topic is relevant to our podcast. But I thought it was interesting and sort of timely that, so I do not actually watch the show Love is Blind, but I Googled it and I did watch the snippets that we're going to talk about. But apparently the premise of this show is that it's like a dating show, and they put you in a pod where you're separated from the other person, so you cannot see each other. The idea being like love is blind from a physical perspective. And these people talk to each other through these pods and then decide if they're going to get engaged based on their conversations. And then ultimately, I guess they decide if they're going to arrive at some wedding scenario. And what is leading, this is the lead up to, this has happened apparently twice recently on the show, where at the altar, the woman has declined to move forward with the wedding based on a difference of opinion in politics. But I think that's like part of what we're going to talk about with, you know, her potential, which at that point is her fiance. So my question, so we wanted to talk a little bit about, as people who are married to each other and also happen to be in an adversarial profession, but that's also sort of like a curious profession where you know, think about things and one person might argue one side of it and one person might argue the other side of it, to be like, where could there be sort of deal breakers when it comes to politics and, you know, your relationship? And to answer, so before this, Scott asked me, what does this have anything to do with the law? And it is a fact, I think, that people are actually getting divorced over this recently. So that would be the legal relationship to this.
I mean, if you go on a reality TV show called Love is Blind and you're getting married from that, or you intend to get married from that, I gotta imagine you don't know all that much about the person before you agree to marry them. I mean, maybe you're getting past the superficial part of it. That's the idea. But I guess it's not surprising that, you know, some people just try not to talk about politics. I guess these people have taken that approach, only to have it backfire once push comes to shove.
Yeah, well, I think I have sometimes like a little bit of a problem with what people call sort of politics versus maybe what might be kind of like values. Like, I think there's, you know, people sometimes think of values as being like a religious kind of or moral sort of value. And I think from that perspective, you wouldn't think that it was quote unquote wrong to say to someone, we don't share the same values, therefore I don't want to marry you. But I think on the flip side of it, when it becomes more framed as politics, and in this situation, I think it is some people on kind of the right side of politics have had a little bit of a backlash against these women, because they're saying like, you know, because I think some of the disconnect between them was about issues like reproductive rights, LGBT rights, you know, Black Lives Matter, things like that. And I think, you know, when you're sort of maybe on the right politically, you'll say, well, those are political opinions and you're being sort of intolerant if I don't agree with you on those opinions. They're not necessarily thinking of those as being on the same page with in terms of your values or your morals or something like that. Whereas I think the counter to that is there are certain things, I think, that do speak to someone's values, that probably makes sense that you and your spouse would be on the same page as. And I think that that's an important distinction of that this person is your spouse. Like, I can be friends with people who think basically anything as long as it's not like something totally horrific. I can be, you know, acquaintances, friendly acquaintances. You know, you have people, not you personally, but people, you in general, have people in their family that like, this is your family. Like, it is what it is. I mean, there's people who, you know, do, you know, become estranged from members of their family. But in general, I think, you know, people understand that you're going to be accepting of, different opinions from your family that you can't choose, and, friends and acquaintances that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis as part of being like a functioning member of society. You have to be open to other viewpoints and whatnot. But this person, like your spouse, to me, that's totally different. Like, we don't agree on everything, but like, there's got to be certain things that you're on the same page as. And in some ways, this love and blind situation is actually expeditious in that, because you could just ask these questions point blank.
No, you probably should.
When you and I, like, I don't remember asking you, like, on a date, like, what are your thoughts on women's reproductive freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a time when people were a little bit less polarized politically anyway. But yeah, I mean, business and marriage, well, you can certainly be in business with someone that you don't agree with politically, as long as you're not talking about it. Although I would imagine there's some reflection of values in how you approach business as well. So that may be an issue. But I would be interested to talk to one of our matrimonial lawyer friends and see what the incidence of divorces in the last 10 years over politics are. I bet the rates are higher than they were even 10, 15 years ago. Because I think
people have more recently had to sort of confront issues that maybe like they just didn't before, that maybe weren't quite as much of part of, people's discourse. And things that have, you could be married to someone for a while and then, it's not untrue. I don't think that there has been some, I'm trying to think of the right word. Radicalization, political radicalization.
Wait, or wife. You gotta be.
Or wife, yeah, for either one. And it could be, you could be like left or right. Like if you went and blew up a Tesla dealership tomorrow, I'd be like, we're getting divorced. Like that would be crazy. But like I would have done the same thing if you had done, something else. Like, and I would assume that would go like vice versa.
Yeah.
But I definitely think things have become more intense recently, and someone who you were married to could do, I mean, that would be true of anything, like could suddenly show a side to themselves that you did not expect. Right? And then
yes, that is accurate. That is very accurate.
All right. Well, we'll ask our matrimonial attorneys. I would like to have an example of somebody who, I don't personally know anyone who has broken up over politics.
I'm gonna ask one of my matrimonial lawyer friends next time I see them. All right. So, anything else that you want to talk about or cover?
Nope.
Okay. Well, that will wrap it for this week. Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe, give us a 5-star review, do all the things. We will be back again soon in the next probably 2 weeks with another episode talking about all the things in the news, legal and legally related. So thanks again for listening.